We know you've been interviewed many times regarding your missions on that historic day in 2001. Can you give us your recount of the day and the missions you carried out on September 11th, 2001?
So I was the wingman for Marc Sasseville, and on that day we flew two missions. We flew the initial mission towards Flight 93, and then we flew a second mission that day, which was supposed to just be a sort of a combat air patrol filling the slot, but we actually ended up escorting Air Force One back in that day. When I woke up on the morning of September 11th, we had that Monday off because we had just gotten back from Red Flag. So in an Air National Guard unit, most of our members are actually part-timers. There were very few full-timers. Now I was full-time because I was still on my seasoning days and I was working towards trying to earn a full-time tour. But even our full-timers were taking days off because since we were spinning up for Red Flag, it had been a pretty robust training schedule. And then we were gone for 2.5 weeks. So when everyone got back home, they wanted to see their families, they had to do their laundry, they needed to go back to their real jobs. And so Tuesday morning when I woke up to go into work, it was a real skeleton crew. We only had enough pilots to be able to send a 3-ship down to the Dare County ranges to Air Force Dare, R5314, which is near Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. The bully flight was made of, bully 1 was Lou Shooter Campbell, bully 2 was Eric Puck Hagenson, and bully 3 was Billy Hutchison. And they were assigned to go do basic surface attack because the jets were still configured from Red Flag. So we still had ECM pods on them, targeting pods on them. We had Su-60s. So they were, or actually no, we had TERS on them. So they were still configured for an air to ground mission sets. But the phase training that we were moving into was for building block training. We were moving back into an air to air phase. So we were going to start off with dogfighting. Well, you can't have all that stuff onto dogfights. So since we hadn't switched over the configurations, those guys went down to the Dare County ranges to go do basic surface attack, which is, I describe it as comfort food for fighter pilots. We just have these little 33-pound, they're BDUs, bomb dummy units, and they're BDU 33s because they're 33 pounds and they're tiny, they're baby blue, and they have a white phosphorus charge on the nose. So when the plunger goes in, it goes poof, and you can see where your bomb hit. And so you just drive this kiddie car track around literally like a big target circle. You call in on final, the Rangers clears you hot, you drop your bomb, and you're working with physics. Because these are not guided bombs. And so it's a core skill that we have as fighter pilots, and there's so much transferability that we get out of that. But it's just fun, and it's one of your basic skills. And so that's why I say it's a bread and butter, it's a comfort food. So the bullies were sent down to 5314 for BSA, and the rest of us, which was just a handful, were there basically doing the administration of the fighter squadron. I was in the middle of a scheduling meeting. I was the training officer at the time. And so it was me and the scheduler. And so it was me, I think scheduler, we had just gotten Drifter Valentine. That was his first day there at the squadron, Mark Valentine. Raisin Kane, Dan Kane was our weapons officer. Marc Sasseville, Sass was our director of operations. And he was our senior leadership in the squadron, because our squadron commander was a part-timer, and JC Witham was, he like all of our part-timers, was not in that day. So we're talking about what's scheduled for the week, who has check rides, who's available for what, how we're going to really do the short range scheduling for the week, as well as looking out towards the month. When we get a knock on the door, and one of our enlisted troops, David Chunks Callahan, interrupts, which was really unusual, and says an airplane flew into the World Trade Center. We looked outside because we had windows, and it was crystalline blue. It was just it was a perfect autumn day. And, we're thinking, so New York's really actually not that far away as far as the crow flies from DC. And we oftentimes share similar weather patterns. Now, it might be a little bit colder up there, so we might get rain and they might get flurries, or depending on, how the front curves in, the front might hit us first and then hit them second. But with this huge high pressure that was sitting on top of us, I mean, we knew it was blue up there too. So we made a couple of jokes like, it pretty retrospectively, obviously, a little tasteless, but as fighter pilots, we're known for having kind of a morbid sense of humor. It's one of our coping mechanisms. So we didn't take it seriously. We thought that it was some little Cessna that had been flying down the Hudson, maybe giving tours, and just bounced off the building. Because we know that small aircraft, they are less, they're not nearly, they're no match for a large structure like a high rise. They bounce off the buildings. It's the cars and the pedestrians below that have to watch out. We just went back to work. It was when Chunks came back the second time, and he didn't even knock. He just opened up the door and said, a second aircraft hit the second World Trade Center. It was on purpose. And it was on purpose was, for me, what really jolted me out of dismissing what we had previously heard, that this was different. I mean, not only was it one instance is a data point, two things becomes a trend, right? So we got up from our seats and went to the squadron bar where our television was, and we saw what everyone else saw that morning. There is no way that we can describe, there's no way you can describe the footage and the impact that footage had on us. Because we knew we needed to get airborne. We knew we needed to protect our nation's capital. We are the Capitol Guardians. But the challenge is that we weren't an alert unit. We're the DC National Guard. So National Guard has two chains of command, right? You've got your federal chain of command, which gets activated and you become Title 10 when you deploy and you go off to war. So you essentially become an active duty member, right? You get chopped to the active duty. Your civilian capacity and your Title 32, which has different restrictions and different privileges and responsibilities and a different chain of command. And that Title 32 status goes up to the governor of the state. Well, as a District of Columbia, we don't have a governor. I mean, our chain of command doesn't go up to the mayor of DC. Our civilian chain of command actually goes up to the president of the United States. And you can imagine he was pretty busy at that time. So normally the president, he delegated his authority down through his chain of command through the Secretary of Defense to the Secretary of the Army. So the Secretary of the Army was the guy who did most of the work, with the DC National Guard. And he did that through the state headquarters. We call it state, even though we're not really a state. So he did that through the headquarters for DC. And mostly it had to do with like coordinating stuff for inaugurations. There really wasn't the same breadth of utility that other states experience, like when the California governor activates their National Guard unit to fight forest fires, or Louisiana has their National Guard sandbagging for storms, for flooding, and then doing ISR and recovery operations after hurricanes. We don't typically do those kinds of things. So it wasn't a chain of command relationship that we exercised that often. So that was our other major problem. Like, how do we get the authority to get airborne? And then the final thing was, we don't fly around with live weapons. And this is the question I get the most, like, how come you guys don't have live weapons on board? Well, a live weapon by design, like, will come off your jet and then hit something and go boom. And that's not something you want. That's not a capability you want in training rounds, right? Oftentimes we would self-oppose for training. Well, you don't want to blow up your wingman. When we go drop our bombs, or even like if we would train for laser guided units. You don't want weapons actually coming off at, big explosive bombs, and then guiding to, to a target. So there are very specific places where we will drop those little 33-pound practice bombs. Anything beyond that, like if we were to go shoot a missile, we'd have to go do that off the southern coast of Florida in a very specific, very highly controlled environment. We don't train like that. And the American public would not want us to. And the other thing too is that it would inhibit us from training, because if something can actually come off your jet, then you don't get to exercise the muscle memory, the symbology, the maneuvering, and all those other things. So there are a number of good reasons why we don't fly around with live weapons on board. But we knew we needed to get them. Now, remember, I'm just a brand new lieutenant, like brand new wingman. I've been combat mission ready for about 6 months at this point in time. I am not doing anything important. I am loading up our data transfer cartridges, so our DTCs. That's basically like a floppy disk for your F-16, where you put in the maps and the configuration for your jet and your navigation data and so forth. And I'm building up our takeoff and landing data cards, and I printed out some maps, and I was done. Like that was the most that I could actually contribute to the fight. And from there, and Brandon Igor Rasmussen and I, he was a young captain from the active duty who was doing a tour with the Air National Guard at that point in time. He and I went and just hawked the ops desk, just waiting for something to happen, waiting to get the word go. At that point in time, our wing commander, David Worley, Brigadier General Dave Worley, had come down from the wing building to the ops desk. And he is trying to work that chain of command up through state, right? So he's trying to go from his level up through the air commander to the DC Guard commander, then, and work up through the chain of command. So he's making those phone calls and trying to get through that way. At the same time, Dan Raisin Kane, our weapons officer, he calls down to the bomb dump, because we do have a bomb dump which has some weapons stored there, and it's way behind the golf course, far away from anything really important, so it's not close. And the thing people don't realize is you don't store bombs and missiles fully loaded up. They have parts and pieces. You've got your guidance kit, you've got your fuse, you've got your explosives, you've got the rocket motor, you've got the body, you've got the fins. All these things need to be put together like a Tinker toy. We don't keep them, stored, all put together. So they get built. And to help people realize how sort of revolutionary it was that Raisin was calling down to these guys saying, build me up some AIM-9s, real ones, yes, with explosives, and I need them as fast as you can. Is that, remember, this is the military. We don't do anything without a paper trail. Right? Normally, the air tasking order comes out with telling you what weapons you'll need 3 days from now. You've got 3 days to build those things up. And there's a whole reason why that timeline has persisted for decades. But now, not only do we not have the authorization, we don't have the air tasking order. By the way, we're in good guy land. We're not in bad guy land. And Raisin is saying, build these things up and get them to the flight line as soon as you can. I truly believe it is a testament to the leadership of Raisin, of SAS, of General Worley, that they decided that that was a risk that they could and that they were willing to take. Without any authorization, without any direction from higher headquarters, because they knew that was what needed to be done. But a risk that they couldn't take was for us to just launch and just get airborne. We knew that our targets, we knew that the hostiles were airliners, civilian airliners. And the consequence of taking action against a civilian airliner in in our own friendly airspace without the authorization, without the direction, without the command from someone in that authority, that was a risk that we could not take and would have been irresponsible for us to do. It's frustrating though, sitting there, standing at the ops counter, knowing what's happened, hearing the news reports about potential other hijackings, the confusion of the day, and knowing that our job is to protect the capital region and we can't get airborne. We had an amazing intel officer, David Nuts McNulty, and Nuts is he's one of the finest people I know, and really one of the smartest people I know too. He was actually fairly new to the squadron as well, and he had some of his enlisted folks. They together were on the phone with Potomac Air Traffic Control, talking to the FAA, talking to the various airlines at Reagan Airport, at Dulles, at Baltimore, trying to figure out what the flight schedules were. So they were trying to build an air order of battle to understand what aircraft were still airborne and what aircraft were potentially a threat to the DCAOR. At the time, we thought there were potentially 3 aircraft still unaccounted for that could potentially be threats. As we're waiting to try and find some kind of authorization to launch, we did take a break where Sass and I and Raisin and Igor went into a briefing room and weaponeered out what we would do. And we would do a single side offset. We would start wide because we really didn't know what azimuth, we needed to have as much radar coverage as possible. So we weren't going to be really tight. We needed to be wider, but we did know that we needed to do a single side offset to intercept an airliner. We knew we'd need to be low, but not super low, because we didn't want to get too much ground clutter on our radars. So we needed to have some kind of look down capability. And we also knew that if we didn't get the missiles on board, that the 105 rounds of lead bullets would be insufficient to take down the airliner. So that was where we first made the decision that if we were not able to get the missiles in time, that we knew that we would need to ram the airliner. We go back to the ops counter, and Sass is actually calling over to the tower there on Andrews, because that's where Air Force One flies. And when the president flies, when Air Force One is Air Force One, the tower no longer controls or owns the airfield. The Secret Service owns the airfield. And all operations shut down except for Air Force One. It is, if you can't taxi, you can't take off, you can't land. And that was hugely disruptive to our training operations when you're a little fighter jet that doesn't carry a whole lot of gas but burns it really quickly. And I had actually diverted a couple times already because I was waiting for Air Force One to be done. And I reached a fuel state where I could no longer afford to hold. I had to go and divert in 2 packs and go land. So we knew that the tower knew the Secret Service. And so Sass is trying to reach the tower there to see if they can call the Secret Service and use that relationship to reach the president. If some way we can go to the top and get the authorization that way, maybe we can get it. In the meantime, Phil Dog Thompson, Dog was one of our, he was one of our crusty old pilots. I adored Dog. He had flown the F4. He'd gone to weapons school in the F4 and then had transitioned to the F-16. And he was just one of those fighter pilots who's just kind of like, he was old school. He was crusty. He was no nonsense. Still had a great, sense of humor. I think I adored him partly because he reminded me so much of the guys that I grew up around with my dad's fighter squadron. And he just had so much competence and common sense. He was our supervisor of flying that day. So he's the adult supervision for the flying operations, making decisions and providing guidance on behalf of the commander. Calls down to the Dare County Ranger and tells him to send the bullies home and tell them to Buster. So Buster, come home in military power as fast as you can. Now, Bully 2 had already come home. He had bingoed out early. Puck Hagenson. Puck was another lieutenant. He was had gone to the squadron after me and had just become combat mission qualified right before we left for Red Flag. So he's still pretty new. So he bingos out. He was already en route home when Dog called down. So the Dare County Ranger sends Bully 1 and Bully 3. So Lou Shooter Campbell and Billy Hutchison sends them home, and they're trailing behind Puck. I always tell this part of the story because I heard it a couple weeks later when we were looking at people's tapes and things like that. When Puck comes, he's approaching the airspace, he calls Dog, and guards off, Bully 2. Dog picks up the radio. Bully 2, guards off, go. Guards off, Washington doesn't want to let me into the airspace. What's going on? Bully 2, guards off, don't you worry about that. I'll take care of this. Dog picks up the phone, calls Washington Center. No, he's one of ours. Let him in. We need him as soon as we can. So Puck keeps on coming home. And then a few minutes later, he calls Dog and he's like, guards off, Bully 2. Bully 2, guards off, go. Guards off, they're now asking me if I've got any missiles or bullets or bombs on board. What's going on? Guards off, Bully 2, don't you worry about that. You just come on home. You have to remember that the bullies were still living in a pre-9/11 world. I don't think anybody who had not seen the footage could have understood what was going on. Just like us when we heard an aircraft hit the Trade Center. I mean, like without seeing it, we could not comprehend it. And the other thing too is that the hijacking training that we had received was all based off of 1970s paradigms, where you intercept the hijacker, you pull up alongside them, you wave, you say hello, you make radar contact, you escort them to a place of landing, where they'll sit for a while, and they'll negotiate until, eventually some SWAT team jumps on board and saves everybody. So the training that we had was inappropriate. Like the paradigm for the anti-hijacking training that we had didn't fit this world that we now lived in. Puck comes on home and he lands. And as I said, a couple weeks later, I had the chance to listen to his tapes as, now we're trying to figure out, what happened and so forth. And on tapes, as he's coming in, he pulls up the ATIS. Now the ATIS is the Aerodrome Terminal Information System. It is a recorded voice loop that changes every hour. It has an alphanumeric code so that when you call in, you say, hey, tower, Andrews Tower, I've got information, Charlie. They know, okay, you've got the most current information. And it has data like, what are the winds? What's the ceiling? What's the barometric pressure? What's the active runway? So forth. So it gives you all this information, and you could just basically, using a simple code, you can tell the tower, hey, I'm up to speed. So Puck calls up the Andrews ATIS, and this is what it says. This is Andrews Air Force Base, information Bravo. Andrews Air Force Base is closed. Washington class Bravo airspace is closed. Any aircraft attempting to enter Washington class Bravo airspace will be shot down. Puck comes in, he lands, and as it turns out, Bully 1 and 2 or 3 are not too far behind. We finally got the authorization after the Pentagon was hit. At some point, Vice President Cheney said, don't they have fighters at Andrews? Somebody get them airborne. And because of the Secret Service, they had our phone number. They knew who to call. So we get the go. We don't have missiles yet. Sass says, all right, Lucky, you're with me. Raisin, you and Igor wait until you get missiles. Lucky, let's go. And run down the hall to life support, down the stairs to our locker room where all of our flight gear is. And I'm mentally going through my checklist to make sure I don't leave anything behind, right? I got my helmet bag, my G suit, my DTC. I've got my harness on, I've got my checklist, and I'm zipping up my G suit when Sass looks at me and says, I'll take the cockpit. And I knew that I would take the tail. Sass would take the cockpit because that would allow him to take out the terrorists, take out the flight controls. I would take the empennage, the tail, because without the tail, the aircraft aerodynamically can't fly. It just becomes unbalanced and it tips over and goes straight into the ground. Now, I've had people ask, well, couldn't you have ejected? And I had briefly thought about that, like for a nanosecond. Could I eject, aim my jet and eject? And immediately dismissed it, because what if somehow I aimed wrong? What if somehow the airliner jinked or moved or something and the vector of my jet just was a narrow miss, and there I am in my canopy watching my jet fly off and watching the hijacker fly off. There was ejecting out of the jet to save my skin was simply just not an option. We go running off out the door, and then, over the sidewalk, and we've got this beautiful, it's like a little creek, and there's this grass and these beautiful cottonwood trees. And I remember distinctly how the sunlights and the shadows were just dappling in the trees because there was barely any breeze. And some of the fluffy little cotton, falling in the air. And it was such a juxtaposition because of the adrenaline in my veins and the threat that we were under, and yet how beautiful the day was. And Sass runs to the first jet on the line, and I run to the jet that's right next to him. Now, normally we get our tail numbers assigned and you might be all over the ramp, but we were just going to take the nearest and the first jets that were there and that were available. And again, remember, I'm young, I'm brand new, I have, no idea. I mean, I'm totally inexperienced. But what I do know is that if anything at this point in my life mattered, this was it. I could not get it wrong. So I run up and I go through my habit patterns, because every pilot knows when you deviate from the checklist, when you deviate from your habit patterns, that's when things start going wrong. So I run up to the jet, I grab the 781 forms out of my crew chief's hands, and I'm going through the paperwork as fast as I can. And Sass is already up in there because, Lucky, what the hell are you doing? Get in the damn jet. And that was when I realized the habits are out the window. Habit patterns are out the window. I was going to have to rely on my own knowledge of the aircraft systems to improvise something I had never been trained for. So I scramble up into the jet, and we have ladders to get into the aircraft. And the crew chief normally climbs up the ladder, and he helps buckle you in and make sure that you're affixed to your seat correctly, because the harness has no parachute. You have to be attached to the seat for the parachute. And he double checks and makes sure that you're tucked in nicely, and none of that. Like I get into the jet and he just pulls the ladder. Normally it takes 10 to 20 minutes to start the jet. And we had just gotten these brand new ring laser gyros for our inertial navigation systems. This is before we had GPS. We don't have GPS. And before this, it would take 16 minutes to align our navigation systems. And this time it only took us 8 because of the ring laser gyros. But we don't have 8 minutes. we need to get airborne now. My crew chief is plugged in with his comm cord, because normally when you start the jet, it's a challenge and response. It's almost like a mantra. You go through the same checks the same way every time, and the crew chief says something and you say something, and then he says something and you say something, and it gets you in your game mode. You really get right-minded for the mission, but we don't have time for that. I'm doing the minimum that I need to do to make sure that I have a safe flying airplane. I'm not going to have an inertial navigation system. I just need to start the engine, make sure the digital flight system is good to the minimum degree, and then I need to go. So it's master battery on, JFIS start 2. At 20%, I go idle. I'm watching my RPMs and my temperatures. So at 70%, need at 40% less than 750. We're good. And then I do my sec check. I do my EPU check. I go to Flickus bit to 43, and I'm yelling, pull the chocks, pull the chocks. And I'm getting ready because Sass is already taxiing. He's almost off the ramp, and I need to get going. And I'm also almost ready to put an afterburner to jump the chocks, and they yank the chocks. The jet lurches forward, and my crew chief is still plugged in because he's still doing the checks that need to be done on the outside of the airplane. He's pulling the pins out of my TERS. He's pulling the pins out of my chaff and flare. He's pulling the pins out of my gear. And other guys are running underneath my jet too as I'm moving to finish up the checks. And the last thing my crew chief says to me is Godspeed, and he pulls the cord, and I follow Sass off the ramp, south down Echo, and we do a rolling takeoff on runway 1 right. We climb out to, I don't know, 2,000–3,000 feet. We're over the mall, and I can look down at the Pentagon, and it's burning. It's this black smoke that is just gently drifting off to the northeast. I get out wide, and we're headed northwest. And honestly, I have no idea where we are because I don't have a navigation system. It's taken a while for that thing to pick up. We haven't found anything. Flight 93, the passengers on Flight 93 are the true heroes. And what's frustrating is that when I finally went and looked at the timelines, we are so fortunate that the passengers on Flight 93 rose to the call to protect our nation, because we didn't get the call to get airborne until maybe 20 minutes after Flight 93 crashed. There was no way that we could have protected our capital from that airliner. Obviously, we didn't know that at the time. I mean, that's why we never found anything, is because they had already crashed. We went out, I have no idea how far we went out, probably 100 miles, I'm guessing, maybe not that far. I know we never got as far as Shanksville because Sass called Branch House. I mean, once we had gone out far enough to be able to sanitize the airspace to make sure that nobody was coming in on that axis, we had to get back to the capital. We had to go back to DC and set up a combat air patrol, because if we had picked the wrong axis, there was the potential that someone, and remember, we were still potentially 3 aircraft airborne. If we had picked the wrong axis, we could have been flanked by somebody else. And since Raisin and Igor were not going to launch until they had missiles, We needed to sanitize the airspace from the last known threat and then get back so that we could set up a combat air patrol and basically be a goalie cap to be able to expand our view of what was potentially out there. SAS did a great job with Potomac approach, teaching them how to speak fighter pilot language. And these guys were consummate professionals, so competent and mentally agile in transitioning their mentality from scheduling and sequencing aircraft on known highways and flight paths and maintaining aircraft separation so that they can time them into and out of the airports, to beginning to identify all the aircraft that were airborne over DC that day, and either pointing out who was a friendly, who was an unknown, or if we saw somebody that they had not previously identified, that we could say, declare, if there was an unidentified radar contact or aircraft, say, east of the DCA TACAN for 15 miles at 3,000 feet, we could say, declare bullseye 09015 for 3,000, and they would say friendly. Walking XYZ, and that's a medevac flight en route to whatever hospital. So their ability to mentally transition into the kind of military airspace control operations that we do to provide air superiority and defensive combat air was, they pivoted like that. They were amazing. And SAS's ability to clearly and concisely and quickly communicate to them what we needed to hear from them was key to them being able to make that transition. Raisin and Igor get airborne, and so instead of doing a counter-rotating cap with SAS, I now take the northeast leg, SAS takes the northwest leg, Raisin takes the southwest leg, and Igor takes the southeast leg. We have an X bar cap that we've set up. And at some point in time, it was before Raisin and Igor got airborne, the Quits, who are the F-16s out of Langley, showed up at about 18,000 feet. And we learned from them about them because NIAD's Northeast Air Defense Sector had called Potomac Approach and was trying to get us up on radio. So Potomac let us know about the Quits up at 18,000 feet and gave us a frequency to be able to reach them on. And so SAS stayed on frequency with Potomac. He and I stayed tied on VHF on our interflight radio. And then I switched over UHF to be able to talk to the Quits. And we began to coordinate our operation with them so that they had a high cap and we had a low cap, and we could provide layered defense to DC. What was great was that because the Quits were an established NORAD asset, they brought with them a tanker. And eventually over time, you know, all the other assets that they had to bear. So eventually SAS and I landed, we went and briefed. We flew a second sortie that day. One thing about the first sortie was that while we were airborne, we got the authorization for free fire. What that meant was, and unprecedented, was that in normal operations, you not only have to positively identify the adversary, but you need to have permission to be able to fire use lethal force. And that permission typically doesn't come from you. You know, you don't generate that yourself typically. For this day though, we were authorized to use lethal force using our own individual judgment. And I have to say that it is truly a testament to the professionalism of all the pilots that were airborne that day, that it was confusing. It was confusing. Clearly, we had all just experienced a national trauma and no one got trigger happy. am so proud that we lived up to the responsibility that was vested in us in that free fire authorization. I think that speaks highly of the character of all service members, and especially of the airmen that we had airborne that day. Sass and I landed. The first thing I did was pee. I really had to go. It's still an issue for women, you know, as I joked around earlier, ejection seats versus toilet seats. Called my mom and dad, let them know that I was okay. And then we briefed some senior Air National Guard leadership. And then we had to get airborne again, because again, we were a skeleton crew. We still needed to feed the fight. So Sass and I were airborne again that day in the late afternoon. And we were sent to go intercept Air Force One and escort Air Force One back in. Now, Air Force One already had plenty of fighter escort, but you know, more is better, I guess, in this case. My job was to fly about 10 miles in front of Air Force One and potentially flush out and maybe soak up any potential surface to air missiles. Sass did an intercept on Air Force One and flew in a loose route, close tactical formation off of Air Force One. So all the photographs you see, that's all of Sass. Came in, I did a low approach, Air Force One lands, and Sass and I returned to the cap. The rest of the day, I mean, from when we returned to the and established the combat air patrol on the first sortie and the second sortie, it's shocking how dense the airspace was with first responders, with military helicopters, with medevac flights, with you know, with small light military twins. But there were also a lot of general aviation aircraft. I mean, the FAA grounded all the commercial airliners, but this was a time before 24/7 media, you know, when we weren't always plugged in. So there were old retired guys that had gotten up, eaten their Cheerios, drove to the airport because it was a beautiful day, had a cup of coffee with their buddies, and then went and took up their Cessna and had no idea what was going on. So we were doing a lot of bumping operations, of turning aircraft away, of trying to get them up on 121.5, of pushing these little, you know, frankly, harmless and just ignorant little airplanes out of the airspace, not only to protect the airspace, but then also enable and facilitate the movement of first responder and military aircraft. We landed, and I went home and kissed my dog and had a beer and went to bed.
Wow.
That was a day.
That was a big day. Yeah. Your first mission on 9/11 was a kamikaze mission. Were you prepared to take your life on that day? To give your life?
Every service member who raises their hand and takes an oath of service is prepared to give their life. Now, we don't plan kamikaze missions, not only because we value the lives of our service members, but from a very practical standpoint, that is a combat asset that once you lose, you don't get back for, like, you know, 4 more years, 5 more years. Each service member that we have, whether it's, you know, like as a fighter pilot, it takes 5 years to build a real combat mission ready fighter pilot, flight lead. And, you know, to get a combat mission ready wingman like I was, it's about 3.5 years. That is a tremendous amount of expertise, time, resources that you don't get back if you send them out on kamikaze missions. And in a real war, you can't afford to expend that thoughtlessly. But I knew what our job was. I knew that the only thing that we could do to protect our capital, and SAS did too, was to fly a suicide mission. And I was willing to do that because there are things in this world that are more important than myself. The Constitution, freedom, our way of life. I mean, I know that America, we are imperfect, but we are still the best experiment this world has ever had in trying to enable the potential, the happiness, the freedoms, the agency, everything that are the ideal of America stands for. This is still the best experiment for us to get there. And I believe in that way of life. There are things more important than me, and that's why I was willing to do it.
When you went up that day, did you think the United Airlines flight might be piloted by your father since he was flying an East Coast track for United?
I never thought about it. It never came across my mind. It was a couple weeks later, my mom made the connection. And actually, Jason Dahl, who was a captain on that flight, he and my dad were really good friends because they had worked together closely in the Denver Training Center. And they had run into each other because they were flying similar routes on the East Coast. So it could have been my dad, but I'll be honest that it never crossed my mind. And it would not have changed my decision.
What were your thoughts and emotions during that mission?
Dear God, don't let me I'm sorry, you probably can't, you're gonna have to, you know, I didn't have any real feelings. There was something where once I knew what we were doing, I knew what we had to do. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't full of grief. There was no drama going on. I just needed to make sure that I didn't screw it up. If anything mattered at this point in time in my life, like if this was why the universe had put me in this place, don't let me screw it up.
What were your assignments in the days and weeks that followed September 11th?
Following September 11th, the DC National Guard actually owned the Combat Air Patrol for a little over 2 weeks. And I actually flew Combat Air Patrols through the next May. I ended up taking the midnight to 4 a.m. shift. I didn't have a family. I just had a dog. And so it was easier for me to take that shift to enable the bros to have a more routine sort of regular rhythm and time with their family. So I flew the midnight to 4 a.m. shift. We turned over command of the and control of and scheduling of the CAP about 2.5 weeks later. Of course, we participated in all of the what happened, why did this happen, how could this have happened, 9/11 commission and all of that and so forth. But in May, it became clear that we were going to begin training to invade Iraq. And so we began shifting our focus of operations to split ops, where we still had more of an alert capability. So rather than being the active flyers in the CAP every single day, we now began sitting alert, which the unit still does to this day. But then I began training to go off to war in Iraq. And there we were scud hunters in the Western Desert.
You went on to fly 2 combat tours in Iraq. Can you tell us about your time, that time during your career?
Well, I'm not sure that there's that much to tell. I was a nighttime scud hunter, which was both a ton of fun and really boring. The first deployment to Iraq was the more satisfying of the two, because we actually had a real mission that we could accomplish. We were also supporting special operations troops in Iraq. And so we were part of the Haditha Dam battle. And, you know, there, for example, that one night when we got wrapped up in Haditha Dam, I mean, it's small things that you remember, right? There was a huge firefight, a lot, you know, the guys, the soft guys had taken the dam, but they were coming under tremendously heavy fire. And we were able to find some mortar pits because the mortars, when they fly through the air, they're hot, right? And at nighttime, you can see that in your NVGs. And so you can actually track the flight path of the mortar, then use your laser marker to then illuminate and find the mortar pit and then drop a bomb on it. And so supporting those guys, especially since they were under such significant fire, was an emotionally significant event for us. You know, getting targeted by your first surface-to-air missile, that's emotionally significant. But there were other points too, which were kind of funny. Like, you know, we were supporting some soft guys who were trekking through the Iraqi desert, and they'd come up on a convoy that wasn't moving. They're really anxious about it. And we're circling and circling and circling and trying to figure out, you know, what's going on with this convoy. We're looking through our targeting pods and we can't figure it out either. We're all just kind of confused. And finally I look out the window and what they had done is they'd stumbled upon a bombing range, an Iraqi bombing range. And the convoy was a series of targets. It was a and they weren't moving because and we couldn't tell what they were doing because they had been, you know, hit so often, they were deformed and so forth. But once we finally like took our heads out of the drool cup and looked outside, you could see the rings of the bombing range and you could see the nuke run-in line. And so we had a good laugh about that. The second, you know, I think everyone has their own personal experience of combat, and it'll be comprised of vignettes like that get strung together. But I think there's also a piece of it that gets contextualized within the broader context of did I matter? Did what we did matter? How has that left that region a better place? How has that left how has that impacted our national security? How has that impacted our global leadership? And I think it's, you know, my second tour, I felt much more conflicted about. And I only did 2 tours in Iraq, and I know many who not only, and I never did Northern Watch, Southern Watch, and I know a lot of my bros had done like 6 tours in Northern Watch and Southern Watch, and then they went off to then do a ton of time in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. The Air Force's men in the Middle East, we never left after Desert Storm in 91. The Air Force has been there for 30 years.
What rank were you when you retired or separated?
I was just a major, just a baby major. Actually, I was not a baby major. I was a crusty old major.
We understand that Christine Mao is a friend and mentor of yours. You mentioned her earlier. She is also featured in the Women in the Air Force exhibit as well, since she was the first female F-35 pilot. How would you describe her?
Oh, God, I love Grinder. She is so dear to my heart. She is one of my favorite people. She is full of love. Her heart is huge. She's wicked smart and super fun and adventurous and witty and really hyper competent, so good at what she does. I mean, and I cannot say enough good stuff about her. I love her all the time. And she's down in Florida, you know, working the F-35 program and continuing to stay involved there, even after she's left the Air Force, and I'm up here in DC. But when we see each other, when we talk, it's like no time, no space is gone. And that's, I think, something that so much of us who've served value about the relationships that we've developed over time, is that although you might not have contact for a while, when you connect, it's the connection, the bond, and the love that's still there. I admire her. I adore her. I just think the world of her.
Our mission at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force is to tell the Air Force story to the public and inspire youth to follow careers in STEM or the military. What message would you give young women considering a career in the Air Force?
I would, I, I think the Air Force made me a better version of myself than I could have been alone by myself. The Air Force was challenging. It was fun. It gave me a purpose that I didn't have before I entered the service. One of the things that I always worry about with STEM is we say, like, as if STEM is the gateway to the Air Force. And what we're telling people is that if you're not interested in STEM, the Air Force isn't interested in you. But that's not true. I was a history major. I was a literature major. One of my bros, who was he was one of the best fighter pilots in the squadron. He was a weapons school officer. I mean, he was a patch. He was amazing. He was a concert violinist. You don't have to be an engineer, an aero engineer, to be in the Air Force. We need so many different skills. We need a diversity of ideas. If you have a passion to serve, to make your life matter, if you want to be challenged, if you want to develop relationships that have a depth and an endurance that that is so hard to duplicate outside of the military, that's why we serve. And we serve because it matters, because it's a way to make our life contribute, protect, and preserve our nation and help us grow. I've loved it. I really have. Like I said, it made me a better me. I just hope to continue to grow. I hope to continue to serve and contribute now that I'm no longer in the service.